Picture this: the most powerful monarch in 17th century Europe, ruler of the richest kingdom in the world, living in the most magnificent palace ever built, and he's terrified of water. This is the story of King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, who allegedly went decades without taking a single bath and believed that washing with water could literally kill him. If you're fascinated by bizarre and forgotten stories from history, don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel for more. Today we're diving into one of history's most peculiar royal habits, or rather, the lack thereof. The man who built Versailles, conquered most of Europe, and revolutionized fashion, was simultaneously convinced that bathing was not just unnecessary, but actually dangerous to his health. But how much of this is true, and how much is historical exaggeration? Louis XIV, born in 1638, ruled France for an unprecedented 72 years, making him the longest reigning monarch in European history. He transformed France into the dominant European power and created a court culture so influential that nobles across Europe copied everything he did, except apparently his bathing habits. The stories about Louis XIV's aversion to bathing are legendary. Court chroniclers wrote that he took only 3 baths in his entire adult life, and each time was under extreme medical duress. One famous account describes how his physicians had to practically force him into a bath during a severe illness, and he emerged declaring that he would never subject himself to such torture again. But to understand why a king would avoid bathing, we need to understand the world he lived in. In 17th century Europe, the relationship between cleanliness and health was completely different from our modern understanding. During Louis XIV's era, bathing was actually considered medically dangerous by most physicians. The prevailing medical theory, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman traditions but twisted through medieval interpretations, suggested that hot water opened the body's pores, making a person vulnerable to disease and infection. Doctors believed that these open pores allowed bad air, or miasma, to enter the body, causing everything from plague to fever. This wasn't just superstition, it was cutting-edge medical science of the time. The most educated physicians in Europe, trained at the finest universities, genuinely believed that frequent bathing could weaken the body's natural defenses. They pointed to evidence like the fact that many people who bathed regularly seemed to get sick more often, not realizing that communal bathhouses and contaminated water were the real culprits. Instead of water, the wealthy practiced what they called dry cleaning. This involved changing linens frequently, using perfumes and powders, and scraping the skin with specially designed tools. The theory was that clean clothes next to the skin would absorb dirt and odors, while perfumes would mask any remaining smells and potentially ward off disease. Louis XIV took this approach to an extreme. His morning routine, known as the lever, was an elaborate ceremony where dozens of courtiers would help him dress. He would change his linen shirt daily, sometimes multiple times a day, and apply generous amounts of expensive perfumes and powders. He believed this kept him cleaner and healthier than any bath ever could. The king's chambers at Versailles were designed around this philosophy. There were no permanent bathing facilities in his private apartments. Water was brought in only for washing hands and face, and even this was done sparingly. The famous Hall of Mirrors, for all its opulence, was built without a single bathing room nearby. But Louis XIV's hygiene habits weren't just personal preferences. They became matters of state policy and social etiquette. The Sun King's court at Versailles operated like a perfectly choreographed performance, and every aspect of the king's daily routine became a model for European nobility. When Louis XIV avoided baths, it wasn't just a personal quirk. It set the standard for an entire social class across Europe. Courtiers who wanted to gain favor with the king copied his habits religiously. Taking baths became seen as not just medically dangerous, but socially inappropriate, a sign that someone didn't understand proper court etiquette. The irony is that while trying to stay clean through perfumes and frequent clothing changes, the court of Versailles became notorious for its overwhelming smells. Visitors to Versailles often commented on the intense mixture of perfumes, body odors, and other less pleasant scents that permeated the palace. The Duchess of Orleans, Louis XIV's sister-in-law, wrote letters describing how courtiers would relieve themselves in palace corridors and behind tapestries, because proper bathroom facilities were scarce, and using them meant missing important court ceremonies. The king himself contributed to these aromatic challenges. Historical accounts describe how his legs developed painful sores and infections, partly due to his active lifestyle and partly due to poor hygiene. The smell from these wounds, combined with his heavy use of perfumes, created what one diplomat described as a uniquely royal fragrance that could be detected from several feet away. Yet Louis XIV remained convinced that his approach to cleanliness was superior. He pointed to his longevity. He lived to be 76 in an era when most people died in their 40s, as proof that his methods worked. He genuinely believed that avoiding baths had kept him healthy and strong throughout his long reign. If you're enjoying this strange tale so far, give us a like, drop a comment with your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button for more weird history. But the most fascinating aspect of Louis XIV's bathing aversion wasn't just medical, it was political. In an age when royal power was considered divinely ordained, the king's body was seen as sacred and different from ordinary human bodies. Bathing, which was associated with common people and communal bathhouses, might have seemed beneath royal dignity. The few times Louis XIV did bathe became major court events, carefully documented by chroniclers. The most famous incident occurred in 1682, when the king developed a painful anal fistula that refused to heal. His physicians, desperate to help their royal patient, finally convinced him that a medicated bath might provide relief. The preparation for this bath was extraordinary. Special servants were brought in to test the water temperature multiple times. The bathing chamber was sealed and fumigated with expensive incense. The king's personal physician oversaw every detail, treating the event like a delicate medical procedure rather than simple hygiene. Even then, Louis XIV approached the bath with extreme reluctance. Court observers noted that he spent less than 10 minutes in the water and emerged declaring that he felt weakened and vulnerable. He immediately demanded multiple clothing changes and extra perfumes, convinced that the bathing had compromised his natural defenses. This incident reinforced his belief that bathing was dangerous. For the remaining 33 years of his life, he successfully avoided any more baths, relying instead on his elaborate system of dry cleaning and perfumes. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Modern historians have discovered that the never-bathed narrative about Louis XIV might be more complex than it appears. Recent research into court records and personal correspondence suggests that while he certainly avoided full-body bathing, his hygiene practices might not have been as extreme as later stories claimed. Historians today paint a more nuanced picture of the Sun King's relationship with cleanliness. While it's true that Louis XIV rarely took full baths, evidence suggests he did wash regularly, just not in the way we would recognize as proper bathing. Court records show that the king's daily routine included washing his hands and face with scented water, often multiple times per day. He paid meticulous attention to his teeth, using specially made toothpicks and rinses. His famous long hair was washed regularly with dry powders and occasionally with small amounts of scented water. The 3 baths that chroniclers documented were likely the only full-body immersions in water. But this doesn't mean Louis XIV never cleaned himself in other ways. The distinction between bathing and washing was important in 17th century terminology. Bathing specifically meant full-body immersion, while washing referred to partial cleaning. What's more, some of the more extreme stories about Louis XIV's hygiene were written decades after his death by political enemies trying to diminish his legacy. During the French Revolution, Republican writers delighted in portraying the old monarchy as dirty and degenerate, and the bathing stories fit perfectly into this narrative. However, this doesn't mean Louis XIV was particularly clean by modern standards. Even with regular partial washing and frequent clothing changes, his approach to hygiene would seem inadequate today. The combination of active physical life, heavy clothing, and limited water use certainly created challenges that no amount of perfume could completely mask. The real story is that Louis XIV, like most of his contemporaries, operated within a completely different understanding of health and cleanliness. What seems bizarre to us made perfect sense within the medical and social context of his time. The legacy of Louis XIV's bathing habits extended far beyond his own lifetime and had surprising consequences for European culture. The French style of hygiene, emphasizing perfumes and clothing changes over water, became fashionable across European courts and remained popular well into the 18th century. This approach to cleanliness actually influenced major historical events. When French courtiers traveled to other countries, their distinctive scents and hygiene practices became diplomatic talking points. English and German nobles often commented on the French smell, a mixture of perfumes, body odor, and fabric treatments that became associated with sophistication and continental fashion. The Sun King's aversion to bathing also indirectly shaped architecture and urban planning. Since bathing was considered unnecessary and potentially dangerous, palace designers focused on other amenities. Versailles, despite being one of the most expensive buildings ever constructed, had remarkably few bathing facilities for its thousands of residents. This architectural approach was copied across Europe, creating a generation of grand buildings poorly equipped for personal hygiene. Even more significantly, Louis XIV's example may have contributed to some of the health crises that plagued European aristocracy in the 17th and 18th centuries. Poor hygiene practices, combined with heavy makeup containing lead and other toxic substances, created skin problems and infections that physicians of the era struggled to treat. The irony is that while Louis XIV lived to an unusually old age, many of his courtiers and followers suffered from preventable illnesses related to poor hygiene. The same practices that the king believed kept him healthy may have made his subjects more vulnerable to disease. By the late 18th century, medical understanding began to change, and bathing slowly became more acceptable among the wealthy. But it took the Industrial Revolution and modern germ theory to fully overturn the ideas that had kept Louis XIV out of the bath for 7 decades. So was Louis XIV really the king who never bathed? The answer is both yes and no. He genuinely avoided full-body bathing for most of his 77-year life, taking perhaps only 3 complete baths as an adult. In that sense, the legend is accurate. But he wasn't the dirty, smelly monarch that popular imagination sometimes portrays. Instead, Louis XIV was a product of his time, following the best medical advice available and establishing hygiene practices that made sense within 17th century understanding of health and disease. His approach to cleanliness was actually quite sophisticated for the era, involving complex routines of partial washing, frequent clothing changes, and carefully applied perfumes and powders. The real tragedy isn't that Louis XIV avoided bathing. It's that his influence was so powerful that his personal preferences became standard practice for European nobility for over a century. Thousands of people followed hygiene practices that were ultimately less healthy than necessary, simply because the Sun King had established them as fashionable. Modern historians have also discovered that some of the more extreme stories about Louis XIV's hygiene were exaggerated or invented by later writers with political agendas. The reality was probably somewhere between the sparkling, clean monarch that royal propagandists described and the filthy king that Republican critics portrayed. What we can say with certainty is that Louis XIV's relationship with bathing offers a fascinating window into how different historical eras understood basic concepts like health, cleanliness, and social status. His story reminds us that practices we consider obviously wrong or right are often shaped by the scientific understanding and cultural values of their time. The Sun King's legacy in hygiene finally ended during the Enlightenment, when new medical theories and changing social attitudes made regular bathing fashionable again. But for nearly a century, the most powerful monarchy in Europe operated under the assumption that avoiding water was the key to staying healthy. Thanks for watching. If this story intrigued you, be sure to like the video, share it with others who love odd history, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.